All right. There we go. Fantastic. It's my esteemed pleasure to introduce Terry Farrell. Terry is the Brown Chair at Stetson University. And if Bill Brown is kind of the father of timber rattlesnake ecology and evolutionary history, I would argue Terry is that way with pygmy rattlesnakes. I first met Terry 22 years ago when I moved to the University of Central Florida. And I got in touch with Terry up at Stetson, and we started talking about various things. Terry hosted one of my PhD students as his postdoc for 2 years, Allison Fenwick, and she absolutely adored and enjoyed the time she spent with him. I'm very excited to introduce Terry and to talk about technologically aided natural history insights.
Thank you, Chris. And thanks to the organizers of this for inviting me. This is absolutely my favorite venue and absolutely my favorite meeting. And it's so nice to come to these and see everybody and talk about snakes. And so I'm going to talk about videos, and I'm going to show you a variety of videos. And my reason for doing this is not necessarily that I have any expertise in technological matters. In fact, not very good at that. The video you're going to look at today is all taken using camcorders. Basically, in a lot of cases, I buy them used for about $200, and they were probably used to film kids play Little League or whatever. But they are a low-cost way to do natural history and make some cool observations. You don't have to have really fancy, big budgets to do this kind of stuff. And so, I hope you're all enjoying the pygmy rattlesnakes doing their mating. But let's kind of talk about the approach here. So one approach is I find snakes coiled in the woods. If Craig and Joe don't want it for a study they're doing, I'll set a camera up on it. And here you can see this little pygmy in Reinert posture up against a log. It's right there, and maybe you can see it in the viewfinder. And so this approach is kind of what I call the focal snake approach. You find a snake, put the camera on it. And then I leave, and that's crucial. It's just like Emily Taylor talked about this morning. Getting out of there encourages the snakes and their prey and their predator to behave in normal fashions without that human presence. Now, in some cases, I do what I call focal locations. And so I'll get in there in the morning, often before snake activity starts. I go to my favorite snaky places, set up a camera, and sometimes I put them real close so I can get, up close and personal with the snakes. Here you see a big garter snake escorting a smaller garter snake out of an isolated fishing hole. And these places are great for snakes because as they dry up, fish get captured here. Here comes a ribbon snake in to try his luck. That looks like territoriality behavior. And he escorts them out, and then he goes back to feeding. And then nature scene snakes are fascinating, but this is the biology of pit vipers, so maybe I should get back to pit vipers. You can see that garter snake just chowing down on these small mosquito fish and other species. So one of the nice aspects of this is some of the areas I work in have lots of water moccasins. And as things dry down, we often go from water snakes to semi-aquatic snakes, Thamnophis, and these guys are the cleanup crew, and they seem to exclude other snakes. And so it's fascinating to watch them at work. And so why am I doing this? Why am I talking to you about this? Well, I'm going to tell you some things, and a lot of you pretty much know this, but this has amplified my view of these things. That I've worked on snakes in this area for 3 decades. I take pride in what I know and my natural history abilities, and I spend a lot of time walking around the woods and the swamps looking at stuff. But when I started doing this video stuff, I found snakes are often exceedingly locally abundant. Not Voback Taylor locally abundant, but quite locally abundant. Snakes are often highly social. You've heard that before, but I'm amazed at the different contexts where I film snakes and they end up interacting with other snakes. Snakes often experience a particular social interaction called Kleptoparasitism, where one snake steals prey from another, or at least attempts to do it. Sometimes we think of snakes as behaviorally pretty simple, but I've noticed sometimes snakes are multitaskers, that it's not like a snake just sheds and that's all it does. I see lots of, for example, garter snakes, opaque eyes, catching lots of prey and scarfing it down. They'll multitask. And snake behavior is both phylogenetically conserved, which I think you all realize, but it's also highly dependent on environmental context, and I'll give you some examples of that. So this kind of natural history observation is really a great way to get insight for hypothesis generation and figure out how to actually test things in a highly rigorous fashion. The nice thing about the way I do this, where I set a camera up and leave, is you reduce the impact of the human observer. Brief behaviors are more likely to be observed when you do long videos and you're not there. You get really memorable video in some cases. It helps, get your stuff out there that other people will see it. And Melissa Amarillo, Emily, lots of folks have talked about if you view snakes doing their daily activities, it actually generates some sympathy for them. They face a lot of challenges. They're not always in defensive mode. In fact, I pretty much never see a snake in defensive mode doing this, at least due to a human threat. A lot of you are thinking, oh boy, snake video, let's watch a snake kill and eat something. Fair enough. And so if you look at this, here comes an anole that has made a big mistake because this snake has either gotten lucky or chosen a beautiful foraging spot. It actually pops up and it sits there and then boom, it slams it. Look at the tail still whipping around. This blew my mind. This is the first time I ever saw a pygmy rattlesnake catch prey in this situation. It basically never released it. And I've done tons of lab studies with centipedes and lizards, and it was always strike and release in lab, spatially simple environments. In this really complex environment, the first time I see a predation event, it is grab and hold. And so that's really fascinating. That's the kind of thing you're not going to get in your natural history observations just by walking around because it's happened so quickly. Now, here's a water moccasin, and you're going to see something else that happens super quickly. A five-line skink is going to come up and approach it, and you'll see this animal try to hit it. And a couple of people have pointed out that not only is it cool to see snakes capture prey, but it's really informative to see them miss prey. And that's what's going on here. So here comes the lizard, boom, miss. And then we're talking striking from centimeters here, right? Let's show it again. It'll take a second here, but that lizard will come back and it'll miss again because it's the same video. But now I'm showing it frame by frame. Each jump is 1/60th of a second. And the meat of that is about 3/60ths of a second. These things may not be the skinks as fancy as kangaroo rats in their ninja moves avoiding snake strikes, but they are really impressive. And so if you're thinking about a fun thing to look at and you love those, ninja kangaroo rat studies, think about snakes and lizards. Okay, here's another situation. And here I've got a snake that's clearly shedding. I thought, oh, I'll just get some shedding video. That's always nice. But a skink comes by, and this snake goes from just basking and shedding. Watch that tail. And within a minute of that skink going by, this snake moves into caudal luring and does a prolonged caudal luring bout here. Lechistrodon does this cool caudal luring where the tail goes way up, right? But watch over on this side of the screen. That skink who came over this log out of reach now is going to sneak around this snake, and there it goes right there. Oh, and now the snake says, oh, damn, So here's a pygmy, and this is another skink video. It's fun to have lots of skinks around. Kind of a typical log posture for a young pygmy. Sometimes they're next to twigs and logs. Sometimes they're on top of them. And look who comes by. It's a five-line skink, southeastern five-line skink. Look at that exaggerated tail motion. It's like a, I'm not from this part of the world. And then watch this animal move around the snake. It doesn't seem to be totally freaked out. It does a display, is it like a zebra-tailed lizard, and moves along. Neat stuff. At least I think so. Here's another pygmy skink interaction. And so here comes Mr. Skink. It got really close, but then boom, adjusts and it's going to work its way around the snake. And so you're going to have to look down here. It's a little bit hidden. But it's funny, they often go on their way. They just do a little detour. It's not like they totally freak out and run in the other direction. So he's like assessing the situation. He'll come down here, and then he'll move along. And so there's really fascinating things going on with venomous snakes, pit vipers, and these skinks. I like this kind of video because I see all kinds of animals. And so we're going to see some birds. And here comes a swamp sparrow. And you may not see what he's reacting to, but there's a pygmy rattlesnake in an arboreal posture here. And this swamp sparrow spent 10 to 15 minutes just moving around the snake, looking at it from every angle. At one point, it was down here looking up at it. And this is something I've seen on several occasions. And it's basically what I do with undergraduates. I make them look at a venomous snake from every angle to teach them to develop a search image. Watch this common yellow-throated male. The pygmy, hopefully you all saw it, is right there. And again, 10 to 15 minutes. This is not mobbing behavior. There's not other birds there. There's one bird there, and he's checking this out from many, many angles. And I like this about field video. I don't know what I'm going to see in terms of the species interacting, and sometimes it's a real surprise. This particular snake had a couple avian visitors. Here comes the mourning dove. So what's the pygmy going to do? Exciting day for the mourning dove. It doesn't quite know it yet. Seems to figure out something's going on. I'm not really sure why the pygmy did that, but I'm generating hypotheses, or at least observations. A lot of times I have no clues for you. So snakes are really abundant. I mentioned that early on. And so a pygmy might be foraging, but that doesn't mean another snake won't come in and interrupt his hunt. And if you've ever interrupted a human hunter in their ambush posture, they're not happy. And I don't think this particular pygmy in front of the little guy is going to be happy when the little guy shows up. Now watch when the little guy moves again. The bigger snake is going to get right in its face. Literally. So there the little guy starts to move, and he jerks around, and boom. Doesn't strike, doesn't tongue flick, just boom. You know, it's kind of like sending the message, get out of my hunting area. There's a lot of snakes, and so this poor snake, a few minutes later, had to deal with a black racer coming by. You know, he was getting bothered by everybody but a prey item. Moccasins interact heavily. These are prey-rich environments. This is what we call a tip-up mound in Florida. It holds water longer than most places. The fish get stuck in there. And here we see a larger moccasin eating a fish. And look at this little guy come up and check him out. You know, moccasins are ophiophagous. They do engage in cannibalism. But they seem to have this environmental context. Sometimes little moccasins will totally avoid getting anywhere near a big moccasin. But when there's tons of food, and these are, when there's tons of food, well, I'm just not going to go back to that. These snakes will interact side by side, even though there's a big difference. And it seems to be they're assessing the situation and what their risk is. Here's a banded water snake. And one of the things we see frequently in nature scene snakes is here you can see a ribbon snake coming at it. It's tongue flicking its face. This is like dogs meeting each other. And you see, this is actually not an isolated incident. It backs off and then it does a little more tongue flicking. And I wonder, this guy is actually eating a catfish that the night before an otter chewed the head off of them. Otters like to just eat the heads. But are they? And then we get photobombed by a catbird. But there's a lot going on in these places, and you're seeing all kinds of interactions. But I am intrigued by this social learning aspect of it all. That Rulon Clark did some neat stuff with Horridus a good while ago, where he showed that well-fed Crotalus horridus left environmental cues, odor cues, that were inadvertently left in other Crotalus horridus would use them to figure out where to forage. They would set up their foraging ambush coils where a well-fed Crotalus horridus had been sitting, not an unfed one. And so you start wondering, what kind of social information is getting passed between species and within species when these snakes interact in this fashion? Here's a shedding snake. You've all seen this. As I get older, my eyes get worse. Oh, you got to have the obligatory gape. And it's always fun to see pit vipers do that, and they do it a lot. But I kind of like just watching snakes. I enjoy it. It is aesthetically pleasing. Other people find them less threatening when they're doing this, right? That's not a defensive response. And so this snake sheds his skin, and I'm actually there watching this happen. And I start thinking, what happens with that shed skin? And so I put a camera on it. This snake is leaving a cue. It's probably leaving a host of different cues. And so he wriggles out of that. Why did we stop there? Did I get to the end? But unfortunately, I can't fast forward through this. But what you'll see is another snake comes up and spends about 10 minutes tongue flicking this. And you've got to wonder, A, presumably it figures out it's a pygmy rattlesnake skin, but what information is it getting? Does it actually, can it assess the reproductive status of the individual that left that skin? Can it determine the sex of that individual? Does it actually know that individual? Can it determine who it is, of which of the pygmies in the area? And so, well, for some reason that's not going to go all the way. We won't worry about it. But basically the video should show, oh, here we go, a second pygmy, and you can see him coming up right in here, giving it a thorough tongue flicking. And this goes on for quite some time. And so this is probably another kind of inadvertent social cue. I have no idea what information that second pygmy might be getting, but I have to wonder. And does it influence future foraging decisions? Does it influence where it moves next? But it really investigates the shed conspecific skin. I'm going to talk a little about kleptoparasitism, right? And so kleptoparasitism is where one snake either attempts or tries to, or successfully steals prey from another. And kleptoparasitism happens in lots of birds and a variety of animals, but we typically don't think of it as a snake thing. We think of snakes foraging alone. Well, snakes often don't forage alone. And this is one of these little ditches. And these snakes are quite small. It's going to be hard for you folks in the back. But there's one ribbon snake, here's two, and one just caught one, and now you've got a food fight. The animal that caught it is going to try to get some purchase back here and pull the prey, and there's the prey stuck between their two mouths. They get pulled under a leaf. Ultimately, and it's nice with video because you can rewind it, you can basically look at frame by frame, they disengage. And this is successful kleptoparasitism, that animal grabbed the fish from the other. And here we go again. A snake gets a fish, boom, we have a food fight. And this is another food fight that will happen, end up being kleptoparasitism. Sometimes the snake that catches the prey wins the battle, but often they don't. And interestingly, in some situations, a ribbon snake or a garter snake will not make much of an attempt to forage. There will be other snakes just rooting around foraging wildly. It's almost like they're just waiting for a kleptoparasitism opportunity. Moving away from this kleptoparasitism, watch what happens here. This is a red-shouldered hawk. It's engaging in tactile feeding, which they do in these ponds because there's a lot of prey. I am thoroughly amazed at how snakes seem to know when a predator is going to show up or when I'm going to show up. They detect threats from a distance. And right now, in this situation, two of the snakes left the pond about 10 minutes before the red shoulder showed up, and two of them are hidden under here. And so it's interesting that I've seen this several times, and it happens all the time when I pick up video cameras. I pick up the video camera and think, oh darn, there's nothing here. I look at the video, and 10 minutes before I got there, there was stuff there. in many cases, multiple snakes. So here's some more kleptoparasitism. In this case, we're going to have a banded water snake, and sneaking up behind the banded water snake, which has got a fish in its mouth, is a ribbon snake. So notice how the head goes higher as the other one shows up. It starts smelling it. Look, there's another ribbon snake coming in the back. Did I mention snakes were super abundant? Boom, there's a fight. And in this case, the animal that caught it kept it. Here's another ribbon snake right down here. It's got a nice mosquito fish. And this is the most frequent kleptoparasite. It is interspecific kleptoparasitism. Catbirds sit up above these areas and just sit there and wait for snakes to catch fish. And in this case, that was a failed attempt, but it was kind enough to do it right in front of the camera. I've got a lot more distant shots where they successfully steal prey. And so kleptoparasitism is important off its interspecific. And one of the things I like about these ponds is they end up with different assemblages of prey in them, as well as different assemblages of snakes. And so here's actually the same pond in a different year. We've had a different hydro period, and fish never got into it. And because fish never got into this drying mud hole, they typically dry down over the span of a couple months in April, June, maybe July. Because fish never got in here, it became a hugely successful leopard frog breeding area. And so here's some leopard frogs. They're not alone there. They've also got tadpoles, and there one is eating another one. That's actually, it looks like it might have been a kleptoparasitism attempt among the frogs. Here comes a ribbon snake in. Oh yeah. Those tadpoles still have some wiggle left in them. And so it scarfs it down. One tadpole is not sufficient for an animal like this. Sometimes I'll see them eat 5 or 6 prey items in quick succession when food is as easily abundant. Oh, and boom! Now, that's a nice little kleptoparasitism attempt, right? And I want to show and highlight a particular behavior. In these nature scene snakes, I think they experience a lot of kleptoparasitism, not just because I see it, but this head elevation and running with prey is something you see when there's a potential kleptoparasite site around. And here it does it after the frog strikes. The interactions between these frogs and these snakes is fascinating. There's all kinds of interactions and behaviors going on. So you're just going to get to see it, eat it again. But Gordon Burghardt, long ago, described what garter snakes do when you have kleptoparasitism. And it involves that raising up of the anterior third of the body and racing off. And this here, where I'm standing right now, I'm pretty sure it's an anaconda because that thing is huge. No, that's a banded water snake. I just like it when different things show up in these videos and do a cameo appearance. So this is a different kind of behavior, and it involves defecation, which is always fun. And once I observed a water moccasin that had been set up in a foraging posture. It left, and as it left, it appeared to caught a lure. And I thought, this is cool. This is kind of like what people in this part of the world have shown in Crotalus cerastes. Right before they leave an ambush shot site, they'll give a little caught a lure to see if they can pull something in. Oop, there goes a folk-tailed grackle. You can see right behind him, he's not far from that moccasin. These animals have wonderful senses of what is dangerous and what is not. In part, that snake has got another decapitated catfish in his mouth, so he's not of much risk here. Now here we're going to see another one of these situations where it looks like a snake is caught alluring as it moves, which, you know, snakes should be, look what's going on here. Look at the urates. Gordon, there's some urates for you. I know you like urates. And then watch this. And this is what I saw. And I went back to the old video, which was taken at quite a distance, looked at it closely, and sure enough, this supposed caught alluring by movement was actually just a hygienic behavior to avoid sliding its tail through its own urates and fecal material. Water moccasins are too cool. If you're enjoying water moccasin video, definitely go on YouTube and visit Cottonmouth Acres site. Frederick Boyce posts from North Carolina, all kinds of cool interactions. I'm going to start another switch of gears here, talk about drinking behaviors. And there's a variety of reasons I want to do this. One is it dovetails nicely with what Scott and Emily were talking about, right? Rain harvesting. Does that occur here in the southeastern United States in lowland swamps, that heavy dew every morning, frequent rains, or is that just a desert pit viper kind of thing? I also like these videos because videos of snakes drinking, they're harmless. They're doing something we can all understand. We all get thirsty. I mean, imagine a bunch of you could use a drink right now. And so here's a black racer first. He comes cruising in, and you've seen snakes drink before, I suspect, and sure enough, there he goes. Here's a pygmy rattlesnake drinking. It also cruised in. I happened to be there as he cruised in, so I filmed it, and hopefully you can see the characteristic drinking mode. And so sometimes they'll drink in this fashion. But what if you look at pygmy rattlesnakes out in the forest when it rains, right? Gordon has shown that these guys have some real, by these guys, I mean Crotalus, have some really interesting adaptations to facilitate rain harvesting. You saw in Project Rattlecam how frequent that behavior is, right? So let's look at a pygmy in the rain. I zoom into it because that's always fun, but then I'll back out a little and it starts raining. What does the snake do? This is classic rain harvesting behavior, right? This is one of the things when I talk about phylogenetic conservation, that looks like a lot of other pit vipers. It'd be interesting to know how many pit vipers do it. It's not just Crotalus. It's also Sistorus. Does Achistrodon do it? Does Bothrops do it, right? Having videos like this could really tell us something about perhaps the evolution of these behaviors, but from a natural history standpoint, it's just interesting to see how it works. Now this is an emaciated snake that unfortunately has snake fungal disease. It gets caught in the rain, and Joe didn't have time to present it today, but he and Craig have come up with a really nice data set that shows snakes with snake fungal disease have deteriorated skin. They lose lots of moisture. And so what happens when it starts raining? It doesn't coil up. It starts moving around on this palm frond, drinking off these little dots. I thought, oh, this is interesting. And then when you think about it, you think about, oh, a lot of the ugliest things we see with snake fungal disease or ophidiomycosis are facial lesions in pit vipers. Is that related to this rain harvesting behavior? Is it conceivable that snakes with skin problems would avoid rain harvesting from their own skin because they've got issues there? And again, I have no idea. These are simply observations, but it does help you generate hypotheses which are testable. Oh, there's a little yawn. So this is another snake with snake fungal disease. I call him Old Puss Eye, and I filmed him because we're just heavily into disease ecology now, and it's interesting to see what happens with these guys. Old Puss Eyes, a female. You can see one eye is just an infected mess. You'll see some lesions down on the body here, characteristic of snake fungal disease. This is a snake in really sad shape. One of the things that's super disturbing is while it was in this condition, a couple of days before it died, a male came up and started courting with it. The social interactions that we see so frequently in these snakes quite likely can lead to some bad things. And so here's Old Puss Eye. I'll get a better view of that side lesion in a second here. And he's got lesions all the way down the body, unfortunately. And soon after this video was taken, it died. And so I sliced it open, and here's more bad news. This is really bad news. You're looking into the body cavity. These are pentastome parasites, Raeliatella orientalis, a species from Southeast Asia, which appears to be devastating pygmy rattlesnake populations. And Jenna Palmisano will give a talk on that tomorrow. But video is nice. This isn't a field video, but boy, it sends the message home that these parasites are a disgusting mess to have in your lungs. They're sucking blood from the snakes. And I think they're a huge conservation concern. And sometimes having some interesting video of that kind of thing can help you get the message out there and keep it in people's minds. But let's go to something happier. Here's some little pups, little baby rattlesnakes. And you can see a pile here, a pile here. Mom's there too. And as you saw with Project Rattlecam, it's kind of nice to see these interactions, right? You may have seen them. Jose Murillo and other folks have got some nice video of their species doing this. And this really does, I think, engender some compassion for these animals, that they are good moms. And another reason for showing this is I want everyone, whenever they think about parental care in pit vipers, to think about pygmy rattlesnakes. That way you'll cite the Green et al. Paper that I did with Harry Green and Dave Hardy a good while ago, or some of the stuff I've done with Craig Lind, which looks at the hormonal control of these behaviors. So I'm just basically chewing that horn. But it is, I think, that when you supply some interesting video with a talk, people are more likely to remember it. And don't look at Shannon Haas's stuff. Go right to pygmies. No. So one of the things I've done, and this is, every once in a while don't just film a snake, I do some manipulations. And here I wanted to, when I originally did this, we showed that pygmy rattlesnakes would defend their young vigorously from black racers. Whereas pregnant rattlesnakes that hadn't given birth yet ignored them. Females that were exposed to black racers that weren't even reproductive ignored them. But these guys react to opiophagous snakes, the mothers, and they actively defend their young. And so this is a cheesy situation where I come in with a coral snake model. There's coral snakes at this site. Here comes mom, right? There's the babies right there. More babies down here. Mom is not a happy camper. She threatens it. And this is the same video, just shown a little tighter. That coral snake model actually was scented with the smell of coral snake by taking coral snake bedding material and putting it in with the model. I moved this around, and we did this with the black racer trials. We actually Velcroed black racers to sticks, and then we could present them in a highly repeatable fashion. But the female, once again, once it realizes what's up, it really can't see that model because it's under there. Boom. It goes bad on this thing. It actually didn't strike it, in part because I had 3 other people behind me getting all excited, jumping up and down while I was doing this. Don't let other people be around when you're having fun. Yeah. And that would be you, Craig. You're all going to recognize this behavior, right? It's a little different in Cystoris. It's not exactly the same as in Crotalus, but this is male-male combat. And so we're going to have a fight. Here we've got 2 relatively equal-sized competitors, 2 males getting in a fight. Their interaction's a little more horizontal than vertical, but they get in a good fight. And in fact, I walked this up, right? Kind of typical natural history. And when you do typical natural history, what you tend to see are obvious behaviors that go on for a good while. And that's what this was. I actually had time to look at this, think, oh, that's cool, watch it for a bit and say, oh, I've got a camera set up about 50 yards from here. I try to get the camera, come back and start taking video of it. But this went on for a decent while. And so this is what we tend to see if we're just walking around. The beauty of video cameras is that they can capture really short behavioral interactions. And so here's a female, or excuse me, a male who was actually sitting on top of a female a few minutes ago, and it comes up to this shedding snake. It'll challenge it, and then you'll see an interesting thing where the snake doesn't rise to the challenge. It instead pops its tail up. And I think this is going to look a lot like some of the things Gordon Schuett documented in his classic work with copperheads, that these snakes seem to have a way of saying, I surrender. And so, boom, there you see that tail popping up right here. The snake makes no attempt to counter this move and to challenge it, just pops the tail up, and sits there and lets the other snake dance on its head. And then it returns to the female. There wasn't copulation, but it was interesting to see these behaviors. That was a pretty short interaction since there was no resistance, but here's a really brief interaction. I don't know what to make of this, but some interactions between snakes in pygmy rattlesnakes are super brief. So here, one of these typical log pigs, probably foraging for lizards, and you're going to see a snake come out of the grass here. And they're going to have a very brief interaction, which you would never pick up if you were there walking along. The likelihood that you would actually see this go down is incredibly unlikely. So this other snake does a little tongue clicking, and then it moves back over to where the coiled snake is, and boom, that other snake is out of there. And so it's really interesting to see these behaviors and to realize that sometimes really brief behaviors that you can capture with this fixed videography can be useful. Now, this is going to be male-male combat in moccasins, but there's going to be a lot more going on. So when I approached this site, this is what I saw. Here you see a very young moccasin with its head up against a frog that had clearly been envenomated. And this pig frog was a great prey item for it, but it's not totally immobilized. And the little guy seemed to be waiting for it to become more immobilized. Now, unfortunately, when I set the camera up, the little guy boogied. I set the camera up, leave. Who comes back? Not the little guy, but a bigger one. The frog is right in here. You'll see it move at some point. And then look what else happens. Here comes the second one. And now they're challenging each other, right? So here we have a bout of male-male competition about to start. Is this about reproduction? Normally, I tend to think of male-male competition as two males trying to gain access to a reproductive female. Here, they do a bunch of this, but several times that was actually the second snake, not the little guy, but the first other snake to approach that frog, tries to break the competition off and grab that frog. But it has trouble because the other one keeps engaging it. And this is going to illustrate a lot of things that I want to drive home. One is that snakes are abundant. When I walked here, I thought there was one snake, and I saw all the snakes. I saw one small snake, and there were actually 4 snakes here. And look at these guys. They're still in their fight. It's kind of a frog's nightmare when you have a couple of water moccasins dancing on your head and you've already been envenomated. And the situation doesn't get better for the frog because in a second, you'll see a 4th snake come in. So snakes are really abundant and they're hard to see. I miss snakes all the time. And I'll set up a video camera, watch my video and think, oh my God, there's a snake in plain sight that I never saw. So they continue their fight. Fairly long behavior, a fairly evenly matched pair, but here comes the big dude. So look at what happens. As soon as this other one comes in, this snake goes after the frog while the other's distracted. It grabs the frog. What's it going to do now? It gets a better purchase on it, and then it boogies. And because this is fixed videography, I don't really know how this turns out. But I get the sense the snake that was so food motivated and kept breaking away from combat and ultimately grabbed the frog and made a run for it. Here it goes. You see it backing up out of the thing. It was definitely in foraging mode. And so there's a lot going on with these snakes. I haven't probably given you any great insight into your own systems. My real goal here is to say these camcorders, which you can get big batteries on if you want to talk to me about them, are cheap, easy to use. You don't need any great sophistication. And it's just fun to put them in places where you know snakes like to hang out. You can make some really interesting observations. So when you think about doing natural history, when you think about doing your studies, maybe think about getting one of these little camcorders or two. Buy them used for 150 bucks because people get really sick of filming the Little League games. And so that's kind of my message. There's cool things going on in the swamp. Fixed video with cheap cameras can get you observations into it. And basically, I'll take any questions if I have time. Okay, I got a minute. Thank you. Just more snakes behaving while we do questions.
Terry, that was probably the coolest talk I've ever seen. Thank you so much. Question about the rain harvesting behavior of the pygmy rattlesnakes.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like, at least in that one video that you showed, that the snake didn't compress its body downwards, and I can't help but hypothesize that it could be a difference in behavior. Is that true among all the time?
I would like to get more situations where they're doing this, and maybe actually like. I agree with you. First of all, you're dead right. They don't seem to do that big compression like you see, but I've only got a handful of cases here, and it would be really fun. There's a lot going on in the swamp. It would be really fun to, squirt a water pistol at them and see what happens. Do they spread out? And I think some of them do. But yeah, it's interesting. There's, it may be a phylogenetically conserved behavior, but it's not always done in the same way. Anything else?
I'm just curious if you ever get a sense that snakes are oblivious to what's going on because they're sleeping.
That is so hard to figure out, right? Especially in pit vipers. I don't think the nature scenes ever sleep on the surface. They always know what's up almost, right? And there's a lot of predators in these environments. And there's also just a lot of interaction going on. I have no idea with pygmy rattlesnakes how to figure out if they're sleeping or not, and so I'd rather not speculate. But it's just very hard. They do not respond much, even when closely approached. That they will stay in crypsis for as long as possible. Anything else? Oh.
Hey, Terry, that was awesome. What is your sense for how far away or how long you need to be gone before things kind of resume to normality like this, where these snakes will come back up?
I think a lot depends on the snakes, and maybe if they were planning to shut down anyway. Sometimes you'll set things up and they'll disappear once you set things up, and it's game over, right? You have to know that, from your own work. Other times it will take, it's more typically 15, 20 minutes before you seem to get the normal behaviors happening again. So you'll find a pair in associated male-female pair. When you approach, the male typically stops courtship. You set up the camera, you get out of there, courtship is likely to resume, but often it's only 10 to 15 minutes, which is nice. And with these cameras, some of them have batteries that you don't want little internal batteries, you want bigger batteries that you can pop on the outside, because they can go for 5 or 6 hours. And that really means, half of this video was taken while I was teaching biostats or helping Craig and Joe round up other snakes. The beauty is cool things are happening, it's getting recorded, and I'm actually being productive in other ways. It's just, I find it endless fun, and I call it snake TV. I sit around at night and fast forward through these, and it's really enjoyable. There's a lot of this on Facebook. If you want to Facebook friend me, that's where you can see a lot of this stuff. I just post stuff, all kinds of weird stuff, but it's not humans. It's always snakes. Thank you so much. What's that? Yeah.
All right, folks, we've had a good day. Don't forget about the silent auction over here. We get started early tomorrow at 8. You're on your own for dinner, but let's all meet